Welcome everyone to part two. There's sushi and drinks and source sheets, also flyers for the upcoming Hanukkah Bazaar. Take it now, take it on your way out. That's this Sunday in the afternoon from 4 to 8. You have to, just like you have to prepare for Pesach, you have to prepare for Hanukkah. Not sure it's in the Talmud, but they really want, if Hanukkah was in the Talmud, they would tell you to prepare and go to the Hanukkah Bazaar. So here we go, part two of our monthly series on remarkable women in the Talmud. Last month, we spoke about Bruria. We spoke about Bruria, the woman, Bruria, her family, and Bruria, as mentioned in the Talmud. We're going to take a similar tact and make some comparisons and contrasts to tonight's figure, tonight's remarkable woman in the Talmud, and that is Yalta, not the peace conference that ended World War II, but the woman from the 3rd century CE, who is the most often quoted woman in the Talmud by name. Now, don't get too excited. It's only like 7 times, but it's more than any other woman in the Talmud. So that itself is worthy of noting. So source sheets, as I mentioned, are up to my right, also on the online. I see a number of people zooming in, so thank you. Hi, Mom. Nice to see you. A little bit about what we know about Yalta. So we know that, just a little bit of a background biography. So Yalta was the wife of Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman was Rav Nachman Bar Yaakov. Lived in the 3rd century CE. Was one of the leading Torah authorities of that generation. He was the head of the Academy of Nardai in Bavel. He was the chief justice, the head dayan, the Av Beit Din, as you will, of Babylonia. He was also married into the political leader's family, the Reish Galuta, right? Power in Bavel was divided between sort of political lay leadership and rabbinic leadership. Lay leadership was the Reish Galuta, and rabbinic leadership was the Rosh Yeshiva, the Reish Matifta, the Dayan, whatever the case may be. Rav Nachman had all these things going for him, and he married into the Reish Galuta's family. Yalta, as we'll see in Tosfot in a few minutes, was from this not technical royalty, but diasporic Jewish communal royalty, right? She was from Bavel, and her husband was a great rabbi, and her family was from the leadership. Of course, the leadership position went hand in hand with great power and great wealth and great stature, and that's something we know about Yalta, and perhaps that can help explain, or that sets a context for many of the stories that we're going to read about Yalta in the Gemara, both in terms of her family of origin, as well as the fact that she was married to a great Torah leader, and living in that house and being exposed to and interacting with Rav Nachman's comrades, Rav Nachman's fellow sages. It seems that both of these pieces, both where she came from and who she was married to, and the house and the activities that were going on in both those locations, are important, are critical aspects of who we all are, and Yalta is no different. So let's look at a couple, and I may mention a few other points about Rav Nachman as we go through the sources. I'm sharing with you 2, 4, 6 Gemaras. There's a 7th Gemara in the Gemara in Shabbat that I'm not sharing with you, but there too it's a reference by Rav Nachman about his wife Yalta, and but we'll start with the Gemara in Gittin. This is not chronological; it's sort of to paint a picture. I've organized the Talmudic sources and references in a way that I hope we put together a composite, built primarily on what we started with of these ideas of who Yalta was and where she came from, but there's some open questions about her motivations, about her intent, about what she was trying to accomplish, about how she was viewed in the world in which she lived in, that will be more of a question as we paint the picture of interpretation. So here we go. I've given some in Hebrew, most in English. And here's a story, the background we're not going to get into, that there was as is the case often, when there's passion about ideas and passion about positions, there was this conflict between Rav Amram and the family, the house of the Reish Galuta, the exilarch in Bavel. And of course, because the exilarch was a man of a position of power and stature, they had the ability to punish their enemies. So we're not going to get into why they chose to pick on Rav Amram, but the story is clear. The Gemara in Gittin, the first source, that members of the exilarch's house would afflict Rav Amram the pious. They would make him lie down and sleep all night in the snow, and the next day they would ask him, "What would you like to eat?" And Rav Amram understood that whatever I would ask for, they would bring me the opposite. So he told them to bring the opposite of what he wanted. It sounds like a Seinfeld episode. The opposite of what you want to do, right? Bring me red meat roasted over coals and diluted wine. Really, he wanted fatted meat and undiluted wine, which is exactly what they brought him. So Rav Amram, of course, right, the underlying point is that the Reish Galuta can afflict Rav Amram, but they can't take away his better understanding of the situation. And sort of Rav Amram comes out ahead, even though he's not the most powerful person in the story. But they were still antagonizing him. So Shama Yalta, everyone see that, right? Underlined in bold. Shama Yalta, Yalta. Again, the bold-faced words in Safaria's translation are a direct translation, and the unbolded words are the explanation of what's going on, right? Because it's sometimes hard to directly translate word for word. So to give you more context, the Safaria translation throws in a lot of extra words. Yalta heard what the exilarch's house did, and again, knowing that she was part of that family, maybe it wasn't her siblings, maybe it wasn't her father, but it was someone whom she was familiar with, someone who was part of her family, right? Close or distant. So what does she do? Right? Umayalele bin Masuta. She brought him to the bathhouse, Umokbile b'maya, placed him in the water, Debe Masuta, the water of the bathhouse, Ad Mahapli Maya Debe Masuta. So the water of the bathhouse turned red like blood, right? It was terrible. He was very in bad shape. But Yalta wasn't torturing him, right? Let's understand. Yalta was healing Rav Amram, right? His flesh became covered with spots and looked like coins. The idea being that the Reish Galuta's house was afflicting Rav Amram. Yalta steps in, and being that she was in the presence of power, and being that she felt that this was wrong, and being where she came from, she felt the ability to speak up and stand up to the Reish Galuta and to protect Rav Amram. So we get a sense that her upbringing influences. Now, again, if she was a simple young woman from a simple background, would she have acted differently? We don't know. But can we paint the picture into suggesting that her upbringing and her closeness to the Reish Galuta's house helped her stand in contradistinction, to reject what she felt was wrong, and not only to think that way. Many people think that what goes on in the world is wrong. Very few of us actually stand up and do something about it. There seems to be already in the first instance, in our first introduction, and this is not chronological, but in our first introduction of Yalta, we get a picture of a proactive woman who's willing to see the situation and act in a way different than perhaps what might have been expected. The Gemara in Kedushin, the first source, the Gemara in Gittin, tells us something about her relationship to her family of origin. It gave her confidence, but also gave her the confidence to strike out on her own path, right? She didn't feel tied to do exactly what her Reish Galuta exilarchic family was doing, but she had the confidence and the self-assurance to affect and impact the situation. As it related to her husband, right? So look at the Gemara in Kedushin, page 70a. So this is a broader discussion about under what circumstances is it proper or improper to communicate with a woman, a married woman. Is it okay to send her regards? Is it okay to send her regards through her husband? And Rav Nachman seemed to be on the lenient side of this idea, right? Seemed to be on the lenient side of this, and he was getting questioned, right? One may not send greetings to a woman even with a messenger, as this may cause the messenger and the woman to relate to each other inappropriately. Rav Nachman countered by suggesting that he sent his greetings with her husband, which remove all concerns. In other words, Rav Nachman felt, again, this is going to be interesting when we get to the Gemara in Brachot, and we think about perhaps the difference between Judaism and Eretz Yisrael, which is perhaps more conservative with a lowercase c, compared to what was going on in the suburbs of Bavel. Right? Now, Rav Nachman is a leader of the Babylonian community, and doesn't have a tradition of thousands of years in Bavel. It's only a couple of generations that they've been in Bavel, or that the locus of power has shifted to Bavel, or been shared by Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Soon it'll be completely shifted. A few hundred years from now, from the time of Rav Nachman, you get to the 6th century, it's completely shifted from Israel to Bavel. But now there's a little bit of a uneasy tension, relationship between, synergy between the two of them. So Rav Nachman says, no problem if I send regards through her husband. And it ends up that it's not so clear that way, right? Which Rav Yehuda said to him, right? This is what Shmuel said. Hachi Amar Shmuel. Ein shorlim b'shalom yisha klal. Right? Women not send greetings to women at all. Right? So there seem to have been certain norms, right? In Israel, right? Like in Mea Sharim, no, I don't know. But compared to what was compared to what was norms in Bavel, Rav Nachman said, yeah, no, this is fine. And then they quote Rav Yehuda from Eretz Yisrael, who says, no, this is not fine. And so Rav Nachman has a choice, right? Rav Nachman can acquiesce and say, okay, you're right. He can continue to fight and be seen as sort of a rabble rouser. So the best thing to do is to listen to your wife, right? So what happens? Yalta, his wife, who overheard that Rav Yehuda was getting the better of the exchange. Rav Yehuda just quoted Shmuel, and Rav Nachman was a Talmud Muvak, a very close student of Shmuel. They say that Shmuel died when Rav Nachman was 7 years old, so he didn't technically learn under Shmuel, but many, many times, many more times than 7 times, the number of times Yalta is quoted, Rav Nachman is quoting Shmuel. Right? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel is kind of like a very standard statement throughout the Talmud Bavli. So Rav Nachman was the preserver of the traditions of Shmuel, and here his Rebbe is quoted as saying something contrary to what he was saying was the halacha. So Yalta said, step down, right? She sent him a message that said, release him, right? Shari le tagre, shavach kishar amaretz. Release him, conclude your business with him, just step back, just stop talking, right? In order to save face, keep lower lip shut, right? Just don't talk so that he will not equate you with another ignoramus. You won't be considered to be an amaretz. Yalta sees the situation, right? Presumably sides with her husband, but says, some fights can't be won. And if they can't be won, maybe it's just better to step down, right? So we see that it seems that in many ways, Yalta and her husband were on the same page. Yalta seems to be a protector of her husband. We have some reminiscence of that from our Bruria class, and when Bruria tells Rav Meir about the death of their children, right? Bruria takes the lead. So to here, Yalta is taking the lead in this particular case, where Rav Nachman, who was viewed as one of the greatest rabbinic leaders of the generation, seems to be getting contradicted. Yalta says, take a step back, and it'll be okay. So we have these two first Gemaras that perhaps tell us a little bit of something, begin to paint the picture of who Yalta was in relationship to her family of origin and in her relationship to her husband. I'm just going to move this down a little bit so that just in case I forget to do it later. Talmudic story number 3 with Yalta is the Gemara in Beitza. The Gemara in Beitza is talking about one of the things about certain things that we're not allowed to do on Yom Tov. Right, so we know we're not allowed to initiate a fire on Yom Tov. Even though we're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, we're allowed to manipulate a fire that's already lit. We're not allowed to extinguish a flame. We're not allowed to reignite a flame. But there are other things that are really limited or technically limited on Yom Tov, even as it relates to carrying. In other words, in the absence of an Eruv, and an Eruv allows for a lot more carrying, just like it allows for carrying on Shabbat, it also allows for carrying Shalol Tzorech. It opens up the vistas of possibility when it comes to carrying on Yom Tov as well. In the absence of an Eruv, we are limited in terms of what items you're allowed to carry on Yom Tov. It can only be those things that are litzorech, that you absolutely need. If you don't need it, you're not allowed to carry it. So that opens the conversation in Beitza, which deals a lot with the laws of the holidays. What are you allowed to carry on Yom Tov, and what are you not allowed to carry on Yom Tov in the absence, of course, of an Eruv, right? Perhaps even when there is an Eruv, there are certain things that are weekday or workday items that should not be touched or carried on, even on a Yom Tov. But let's assume that this is talking in the absence of an Eruv. What items are more restrictive, but that we could surmise have a potential holiday use, but not necessarily. So the Gemara was talking about various couches, sedan seats. I think like the way that rich people were carried in the streets, right? It's like the original Ubers. And someone would come and literally pick you up. That's why we'd say, can I pick you up? Right? They would pick you up, right? So you'll see it sometimes at bar mitzvahs and weddings, right? They'll come in on the sedans, right? So when they used to really use those, the Gemara entertains the possibility that that's forbidden to be used on Yom Tov. It's not necessary. We're not talking about a wheelchair, somebody who can't walk, somebody who can walk, but their normal mode of transportation, they didn't walk outside. They were of a certain socioeconomic status. They didn't need to walk outside, right? So they had people that carried them. You're not supposed to ride on one of these sedans and these couches on Yom Tov, or at least that's suggested. But so the question then becomes based on a Maisa Shahaya, right? A Maisa Shahaya is, you just said something's not allowed, but we know of a story in which somebody did it. And who's that somebody? Is that so? But didn't Rav Nachman, right? So the next source, based on 25b in the English, didn't Rav Nachman permit his wife Yalta to go out on a festival on a chair, borne on poles that rested on the shoulders of the bearers, right? Yalta, right? Presumably between Yalta's family and her husband's family, she always lived a pampered life, right? She always had somebody picking her up. So, and Rav Nachman allowed, right? We began to see that Rav Nachman seems to be not afraid to be on the more permissive side. And when it came to regards to a woman through her husband, here too, Rav Nachman allowed Yalta to be carried on a chair on a holiday, which was otherwise prohibited. The Gemara answers, Shani Yalta Devi'ita. Yalta is different. She was afraid of falling and therefore required this special arrangement. In other words, had she not been allowed to go out on a chair, she never walked. Right? She never left the house without this accommodation. And therefore there was a special permission given. Right? Generally not, Yalta was different. The Gemara then goes on, and it's important because we're going to look at Tosfot in a second. Right? Tosfot is a medieval 12th century commentary on the Talmud. Right? The Gemara says that this was also the idea that there was an exception, that certain exceptional people were carried on these sedans, on these chairs, even on a holiday, was not just for Yalta. Meimar and Marzutra would be carried in their place to the study hall on the shoulders of their students for the public lecture delivered on the Shabbat of the festival. They would be carried in that manner due to their fear of falling. Right? So the first answer given as to why they too were allowed, Meimar and Marzutra, certain rabbis were allowed to be carried to the Beit Medrash is because they also were afraid. They would not leave the house unless, right, they had this certain accommodation. Right? And therefore they were allowed to. But the second answer is some say The reason was due to the pushing of the crowd, as the sages were afraid of being crushed by the large number of people attending the lecture. In other words, it was a tzorech of the tzibur, right? Because they were going to lecture in the Beit Midrash, and because there were large crowds in the Beit Midrash on the holiday, so in order to get through those crowds in a safe manner, a comfortable manner, they were allowed to be carried, right? So Tosfos would say, this is the only, I didn't translate it, but it's just a line. If you'll allow me, indulge me. Shani Yalta Devita. The only reason we gave that, the only permission we can conjure up as to why Rav Nachman allowed his wife to be carried on a sedan, on a couch, is because she was afraid. Otherwise, she wouldn't leave. Otherwise, she wouldn't leave the house. But the question, sort of in the back of our minds, is okay. So she doesn't leave the house, right? Right when it came, before there were Erevins, right? What we told women for the most part that you switched off with your husband, but you stayed home. We didn't make an exception across the board. So she was afraid, so she should stay home. It doesn't seem to be enough of a reason to create an exception. So that's why Tosa would say something interesting. As it's sort of hinted at in the next piece, which we just read about, Amemar Marzutra, and even further on in the Talmud, which I haven't given you, it seems that just because you're afraid to walk is not enough of a reason to allow you to ride on a couch on Yom Tov. There has to be a tzorech rabin. There has to be a public need for this to happen. One individual riding on a couch is not generally a public need unless that one individual is needed by the public. So we're going to get somewhere here, right? So Tosfos would say, Yishlomar Dilma Nami, Halcha L'Tzorech Rabin. This is fascinating. Tosfos would say that perhaps one should understand that Yalta left her house on Yom Tov was a communal need. Why? Shabbat Rosh Hagola Haita, because she was the Rosh Reish Galuta, right? Tosfos is not, I'm not sure how to put this. Tosfos is not willing, able to entertain that Yalta was needed because she was giving shir, right? He doesn't say that, right? But he sort of leaves it open as to what exactly it was that Yalta was needed, right? The other people that are needed, that are allowed to be carried on a sedan, are those that are teaching Torah in public, right? Tosfos does not say that Yalta was teaching Torah in public. I don't want you to get that misunderstanding. Nonetheless, sort of leaves it very ambiguous. Shabbat Rosh Hagolah Haita, she was the daughter of the Exilarch. And the general public needed her. Why did they need her? I don't know. Tosfos doesn't say. Right? So Tosfos was forced to say that there's a need at Tzorech Rabim. Tosfos is unable to, probably not unwilling, unable to entertain that Yalta is teaching Torah to the masses. So he just leaves it. He just leaves the grenade there, right? He doesn't explode it. He just leaves the grenade and says Yalta's needed, and that's why she'd be allowed to ride on a couch. And just like the rabbis who were needed to teach Torah were allowed to ride on a couch on Yom Tov. The idea that Yalta never stepped foot on the ground is not hard for us to understand. She came from a privileged background. Socioeconomically, but also the company that she kept. And in the next sources we'll see that she kept the company of Talmidei Chachamim. And so to suggest that it's this combination of how exactly it plays out, but the combination of her status within her family of the political leadership and her familiarity with Torah concepts from both her upbringing and her married family leads you to see that there's a tzorech rabin there, at least according to Tosfos, that Yalta filled.
Were there other categories of public need that would allow people to do this role also? So, for example, the Gavayim, do they do that? Or like maybe there's like a public morale kind of thing with that also?
Right. So it's hard to know, and I don't think Tosfos, right? Like that. My theory to you, my suggestion to you is that Tosfot wasn't 100% sure. You could imagine that perhaps on the holidays there was a little bit more of a need of interface between the Jewish. I mean, even we know that here, right? We want to talk to our law enforcement when there's a holiday. There's more people out. There's more kids out. There's more people hanging around. There are people not at work, right? So we can, even in our frame of reference, we can imagine that there would be some interface and some coordination between the organized Jewish community and the powers, the Persian powers at the time. Was Yalta a linchpin in that? Was she head of the Shomrim? I mean, I don't know. I'm just trying to interject what the Tzorech Rabim within a framework of something that we know, but I think it's an unknown. Right? It was not defined. It was not defined. But that's what we see from the Gemara, from the Talmud in Beitzah, that Yalta comes from a privileged family, and according to Tosfot, she was an integral citizen, an integral leader. That she had a role that could be considered Tzorech Rabim. Right? I don't want to overstate, but I don't want to understate what Tosfot says. Along the lines of Yalta being a woman that felt comfortable within the ranks of the rabbinic leadership of the time, of the poskim and the Talmidei Chachamim, we have this Gemara Nida. The Gemara Nida teaches a lot of things. I'll mention some of them, but there's certain lessons specifically as it relates to Yalta. The Gemara relates that Yalta, Rav Nachman's wife, just move down a little bit, there we go, brought blood before Rav Bar Huna, right? So she had, this is a Tarat HaMishpacha question. She had a question about a bedika cloth. So she brought it to Rav Bar Huna. He said that she was that it was tameh, that it was problematic. She then brought it before Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Yehuda, and he said that it was okay. Right? So we have Yalta interfacing with the rabbis, which is not necessarily remarkable. That could have been par for the course. The reason why this is a story, of course, is because generally we believe you should ask a question once, asked and answered. Asking again sort of is problematic, right? So the Gemara sort of picks up on that and says, how could Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Yehuda, who was asked second, act in this manner and permit something if Yalta had asked the question earlier? Isn't it taught in a Braita, in the case of a halachic authority who deems an item impure, another halachic authority is not allowed to deem it pure? One halachic authority deemed the matter prohibited, another halachic authority is not allowed to deem it permitted. So again, the question is on Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda. It's not on Yalta, right? We don't ask how is Yalta allowed to bring the same question to two different rabbis. The question is, why was Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda allowed to weigh in if he knew? And we're going to see in a moment that he did know, and that's really the answer. We'll explain that initially Rav Yitzchak bar Yehuda said the same thing, but he changed his mind when Yalta said to him, "Every day I bring blood of this kind to Rav bar Huna. I've brought a bedika cloth of a similar type, the same discoloration, and he's always said that it's tahor, that it's okay. Today he issued a different ruling, and I know that he has literally an eye infection. I know that there's a problem with his eye, right? So Yalta's stepping up. Yalta's saying, I know, right? Yalta's not bucking the system necessarily. Yalta's saying that everyone, men and women, are partners in the halachic system, and that if I know something to be correct, if I know something to be tahor, and I bring that question to a rabbi, and the rabbi gives me an answer that seems inconsistent with what I know to be the case, I am empowered. Maybe Yalta only at that time felt empowered, but the system empowers the questioner to take it one step further, whether you're a man, whether you're a woman, to take a step further and to ask, well, wait a second, something's off here. And therefore, Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Yehuda was well within his rights to paskin counter to what the first rabbi Rabbi Bar Rav Chana said. So again, what at first glance you might see Yalta as really being rebellious, right? As being as sort of leading the charge against the system that she felt was incorrect. But the way and maybe that's right, but as interpreted by the Gemara, all she was doing was that she was taking an active role in her halachic life, right? And therefore, if something didn't sound right, it seems based on the Gemara doesn't fault Yalta at all. In fact, the Gemara just asks about why was the rabbi allowed to, answer the question, and we give the reason why. The last part of the Gemara says, but are people deemed credible to present claims such as the one presented by Yalta? In other words, do we trust women as it relates to questions of Taharat HaMishpacha? Do they always have to bring, and this is sort of the bigger question, that doesn't have to do with Yalta. Do women always have to bring a question to a posek, somebody trained in the colors of Taharat HaMishpacha, of Bedikas, or are they allowed to play a role in that? And the Gemara says very clearly, black on white. The Gemara says, yes, a woman is deemed credible. She said, I saw this color and I don't have it anymore. Right? I flushed it down the toilet, or I lost it, or I threw it out, or whatever the case is. Right? And I just, as an aside, I tell women that. I tell women, if you've asked the Shiloh and it's been answered and you have a similar situation again, if you want a rabbi to weigh in on it, then we're happy to do so. If you're confident that you can answer the question yourself, then you are entitled and you're welcome to do so as well. And that's what Yalta is. That's what Yalta did. Yalta took ownership, right? Proaction on her part of an area of law unique to women, and said, there's a partnership here, right? There may be a need at times to consult, but there may also be a need to question, and a need to clarify, and a need to confer and consult, and talk it over back and forth in order to get to the truth of the matter. And so here we see another facet. Again, would a woman without the background of being from the home of the Reish Galuta, without being the wife of the great Rav Nachman, be comfortable in that position, in that condition? I don't know. If you ask me, probably not. But what it seems to be is that Yalta utilized that background and that confidence and that competence that she had in order to certainly blaze a trail, but blaze a trail that's very much, to me at least, is in line with traditional Jewish and halachic values. Along those lines of Yalta being a bit of a trailblazer is the next Gemara, the Gemara in Chulin. And the Gemara in Chulin is not telling us anything that's not pretty much agreed to by everyone, but it's the framing that Yalta does in describing this point that is worthy of our consideration as we think about who Yalta was and what is her legacy and what are the lessons that we learn from the anecdotes and episodes found in the Gemara. So this is a story in Chulin. I only gave you a very brief quote from the Hebrew and then much more in the English. I'm really Yalta Rav Nachman, and again, often Yalta's not in the base medrash. Yalta's not speaking to other men. Yalta generally is speaking to Rav Nachman, but it's then recorded and learned in Batei Medrash across the world throughout history in Yalta's name, right? So what does Yalta say to her husband? Mechti kol da'asar lan rachmana shar lan kavaseh. Where she suggests that anything that's prohibited in the Torah, any prohibition in the Torah has a balance, a counterbalance that's permitted, right? And look at the example she gives, right? Right? We're not allowed to eat blood, but we're allowed to eat liver. And even after you kosher liver, there's this idea that liver is kulo dam. right? What does liver taste like? It tastes like blood, right? For better or for worse. That's why you put so much stuff in it, right? You don't eat it plain, you eat it with stuff, right? Right? So you have liver and blood, right? In general, right? Dam nida is prohibited, right? If a woman is going through menstruation, then that's prohibited to have relations with her. But there is a certain dam that's dam tahor in the aftermath of childbirth. Right? According to the Torah, there's a period of time in the immediate aftermath of childbirth that even if a woman is bleeding, she's permitted to be with her husband. Torah prohibits the consumption of chalev when it comes to a cow or a sheep or a goat, but permits chalev, right? Those parts of the blood of the fats in a deer or a bison or other undomesticated animals. And they say it has the same flavor. I don't know, right? That's the joke. Doesn't it tastes just like pork, right, Rabbi? I don't know. And, it's prohibited to eat pork, but you're allowed to eat the brain of a shibuda fish. What's a shibuda fish? It's a fascinating topic. You can Google it afterwards. But they say it tastes like pork. You're not allowed to eat a certain non-kosher fish, but you're allowed to eat the tongue of a fish, which tastes similar. You're not allowed to sleep with a married woman, but you're allowed. But if, unlike Catholicism, where when you're married for life, if that woman gets divorced, then you're allowed to marry, right? Again, these are not exactly the same, but she's trying to make the point across the board. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife, but in the case of Yibam, it's a mitzvah to marry your brother's wife, right? You're not allowed to marry a non-Jew, but in the case of a Esha Yifat Toar, that specific case, it's permitted, right? So it's right. This is what Yalta says, right? Yalta says wherever there's prohibitions, there's permissions. As if Yalta, right? And one possibility is that Yalta is trying to, similar to what, by the way, you could put that in context with the Gemara Nida, where she's arguing for a permissive ruling. You can put that in the context of the Gemara in Beitza, where it was a permissive ruling. You could, right? She was allowed to be carried on the sedan, on the couch. Or in the context of the Gemara in Kiddushin, where her husband was advocating for a permissive ruling, right? Yalta, we could suggest that the approach of Yalta is summarized in this Gemara, and that is that we should not define Judaism through that which is prohibited, but we should be just as quick to note those areas in which Judaism is permissive, right? There's this idea of koach adif, right? That it's easy to be stringent. It doesn't take a lot of Rav Avaja Yosef was famous to say you don't have to be a Talmud Chacham to prohibit something, right? Because if you just say better not to, okay, better not to, right? Of course, right? And granted, not to completely diminish that. At times, if we don't know, then or if there's a legitimate suffix in halacha of a doubt, then of course it's better not to than to potentially violate a prohibition. But that's not the defining attitude of halacha, right? The defining attitude of halacha is to learn and to engage and to enjoy and to benefit from all that is permissible, right? And to avoid those things that are prohibited. But not every suffix should be l'chumrah, right? Not every suffix should be l'chumrah, granted. And this is part of the, what Yalta seems to be addressing is something that also exists in 21st century Orthodoxy as well. And part of it has to do with the ultimate, one could suggest, the widespread acceptance of the Mishnah Brura as a code of Jewish law written by the Chafetz Chaim. And the way the Chafetz Chaim wrote his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazic Jewry of 19th century Poland and Eastern Europe was that in many cases, he would bring down a lot of different opinions, and he would end off by saying, Hamachmir tavo alav brach, that even though it may be permissible, if you are stringent, then that's praiseworthy. Or Bali Maisa Machmir. If you are a person who is of spiritual stature, you will avoid the question and be Machmir. There's nothing wrong with that. But what's important to note is that many of us are not on that stature. And if we're not on that stature, we should be aware of what's permissible according to halacha. And Yalta comes along and tells us that's the attitude. It's not about what we can't do, it's about what we can do. It's not to say everything's permissible, but there's a lot that is. And even those things that are prohibited, God has found a way to allow us to have a taste of that which is prohibited, right? So it's a very powerful lesson. I think has a lot to teach us. And then the conclusion of that. Now, again, whether the conclusion of that is meant to be understood as completely self-serving, or just to tell us a little something else about Yalta. Yalta then says, I want to eat something that tastes like basar b'chol. Right? What tastes like milk and meat? Right? So that's actually the reason why this is mentioned, because the Mishnah in Chulin talks about udders, right? The udders of a cow, which is where the milk is held, and it talks about how you're supposed to go about preparing those udders in order to eat them and kosher them. And although it's true that you're supposed to slice them sideways and forwards to allow them to completely drain, the halacha is that if you roast the udders, then when you roast them, as opposed to pot boiling them, you don't necessarily have to do that. So if Nachman goes to his butcher and says, get me some udders, roast them, please, give them to my wife, right? Yalta gets what Yalta wants, right? Yalta wants to try basar b'chalav, right? Maybe to teach us all a lesson, but also because of who she is and where she comes from. And that's how we, right? And Rav Nachman acquiesces and facilitates what Yalta wants. Yeah, go ahead.
I find it interesting that this whole thing is repeated, but it shows her, well, how smart she is and her brilliance, but, her reasoning.
Right.
And the fact that was repeated, maybe that was to show us that she was.
Right.
Seriously.
Now, again, it could, there's no, yeah, it's nice that it's quoted in the name of Yalta. I would just point out that there's no chidush in what she quotes settled law. In other words, the fact that you can't marry your brother's wife, but you can marry a yibum, but she put it, right, she did put it together, and whether she put it together in order to have udders or it's just quoted that way because if we want to round out what we know about her, I would agree with that. Yeah.
I was gonna say she was educated, but it's sort of like she knew the answer. I'm assuming
Right.
women of a certain social strata were educated.
Well,
You ever say-
sure. Well, whether they were educated, deliberately, or they were just surrounded by educated people, and that was the discourse of the house. That was the discourse in Rav Nachman's house. That was the discourse in the Reish Galusa. That I don't think we know that necessarily. Now, Yalta seems to make halachic arguments to a greater degree than was on Buri, right? To a much greater degree, sort of quoting things halachically. And in our last example, we're going to see that Yalta very much Yalta and Rav Nachman sort of have this is a great way to end. We're finishing up the hour, so it's a good time to end as well. The Gemara in Brachot. The Gemara in Brachot tells us a story, and remember I mentioned about how Rav Nachman was in Bavel, and the center of religious life was still Eretz Yisrael, but there was a power sharing between Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. Ultimately, it would shift completely to Bavel for centuries, millennia, until the modern state of Israel, where now it's shifted back to Israel. But so the story tells about Ula. Ula was from Israel. And it seems that he would travel to Bavel. One suggestion is that he would travel to Bavel to collect money. Right? Some things never change, right? Coming from Israel to collect money in the diaspora, right? So he came to Rav Nachman's house, and he was a great scholar. So Rav Nachman put him up, and Rav Nachman was a man of means, had a big house, he had a lot of room on his table, had a lot of money to go around. I'm sure he was hospitable. We know from other stories that Rav Nachman was in fact hospitable. So he ate bread and recited grace after meals, right? So he was honored, right? Generally speaking, you honor the guest with leading the zimun, right? So Ula is leading the zimun, gave him the cup of blessing to Rav Nachman. And so after there's a custom. Oftentimes we only do this with minyan, although there's no You can do it with a mezuman of 3, benching over a kos. Right, you have a cup of wine where you say the zimun over. So Ula did so, and you know how like we do it for Sheva bracha, right? We give it to the bride and groom. So there was a custom to give this koshel bracha, a cup of wine over which blessings were recited to the baal bayit, to the host, right? The guest would bench and then the guest would give the cup to the host to drink. So Rav Nachman said to Ula, send the cup to my wife, right? Rav Nachman knew, who was the boy. He might have been the head, but Yalta was the neck, right? So send the cup to my wife. And Ula said, what is this feminist stuff? Come on, what's going on? What are you doing, right? Ula said, there's no need. Rabbi Yochanan from Eretz Yisrael said as follows: the fruit of a woman's body is blessed only from the fruit of a man's body. In other words, whatever blessings, even the blessing of children, is a result of the man. Right? Tell that to a woman in labor, right? But that's what Ula quoted in the Rabbi Yochanan, and he quotes a pasuk. Ein pri bitna shel isha mitbarach el mi pri bitna shel ish nemar uverach pri bitnecha. Right in Parshat Akev, I believe. Right, it tells us that God will bless the fruit of your stomach. Bitnecha, right? So what bitnecha literally, right? Grammatically, your stomach male. Bitnech would be your female stomach. Of course, the problem with that is that the psukim always talk about Yisrael in the masculine. It doesn't mean to preclude or exclude women. So it's very shaky ground. This Ula interpretation from Rabbi Yochanan is not pshat. Nish pshat. Right? You'll bless the fruit of your body, right? The wife is blessed with children and is sufficient to give the cup to Rav Nachman, right? So Yalta, being from the Reish Galusa, being in Bavel, being Mrs. Rav Nachman, was not used to being treated this way. So what does she do? The Gemara relates that meanwhile Yalta heard Ula's refusal to send her the cup of blessing. Yalta was the daughter of the exilarch, right? This is commentary. Was accustomed to be treated with deference, as we suggested. Right? That's not the words of the Talmud. I just want to make that clear. What is the bold part. She arose in a rage, entered the wine storage, and broke 400 barrels of wine. She says, okay, don't give me the cup. It was their wine. It was Nachman's wine. Well, it was her husband's wine. I'm sure her father had wine too. So Rav Nachman said to Ula, send another cup. And please don't stir the pot and then leave. Right? So Ula sent Yalta a different cup with a message saying that all the wine in this barrel is a wine of blessing. Although you did not drink from the cup of blessing itself, you may at least drink from the barrel from which the cup of blessing was poured. So she didn't leave it at that. Right? She sent him back a scathing response, right? Which she said as follows: from itinerant peddlers come meaningless words, and from rags come lice. In other words, she put him in his place. You're a schnorrer. That's what you're like. Basically, that's what she said about her. You're a schnorrer. You're gross. You come from Eretz Yisrael. You're all sweaty and disgusting. You don't know our norms. You don't have proper respect. What can I expect from you, right? Lice, ignorance, right? So she is sharp. Just to round it out, so that we don't judge her too harshly. The Maharsha says that the idea that Yalta broke so much wine is to show that it wasn't about the wine. Obviously, she didn't need a sip of wine. She wanted the blessing, right? She wanted the blessing that's associated with a koshel bracha. And the Chida, in his commentary to Talmud Ben Yehoyada, points out that the 400 number is found in a number of places in Talmud, and the gematria of the words ayin ra, evil eye, is 400. And Yalta was upset at Ula's ayin ra, his unwillingness to send her wine of a koshel bracha, his stinginess and his willingness to share blessing. Again, we said that his interpretation based on Rabbi Yochanan is weak, right? All the psukim are in the masculine. So Yalta broke this. So according to the Chida, she didn't break the barrels. She broke the barrels open and had a come one, come all. Had a wine tasting for all the people. She did not, don't worry, Hannah, she did not waste the wine. She gave it to the poor. She gave it to anyone who wanted to come. She had a big wine tasting. She said, Ayin Ra. The problem, right? Ulo had an Ayin Ra. He was unwilling, he was stingy with blessing. I'm going to create lots of blessing. I'm going to share my wine with as many people as possible. That's the Chida in Ben Yehoyada, right?
The truth is, the host said to him, give this to my wife, and he should have.
Right. Forget about anything else, right? Right. We're in Bavel. We're not in Eretz Yisrael. This is even if in other houses in Bavel, it goes differently. In the Nachman house, Yalta gets the cup, right? And that's how it should be. That's how it should be appropriate. That's how that would be most appropriate. You mentioned truth. So one last point from the Chida, the gematria of the word Yalta is 441, and the gematria of the word Emet, truth, is also 441. So if we took a moment as towards the end before we said Yalta was teaching us an important lesson about the fact that we shouldn't run for the koach de chumrah. We shouldn't always be looking to be stringent. We should be looking to be truthful. What's the truth about the halacha, right? You could interpret Yalta as being looking to overrun the system and to break down barriers. But what it seems to be is that Yalta was looking for her truth, but really to expand our understanding of what truth really is, of what the value of not always being stringent, the value of appreciating and respecting other people's opinions, right? Maybe in Ula's house they don't pass the cup to the women, but in Rav Nachman's house they do, and this is all part of the Jewish understanding of what emet is, right? Emet is a little bit all-encompassing. The word emet has an aleph, a mem, and a taf, first, middle, and last letter of the alphabet. This idea being is that emet is not just one narrow path, but there's a diversity of opinions that could all be true. Yalta seems to teach that in a number of places to her benefit, right? Like to allow her to ride on the caravan, to allow for a second opinion on the Tarad Mishpacha question, to allow her to have the kosher bracha. But it's not, it wasn't necessarily exclusively self-serving. I think it teaches a very important lesson for all of us about the importance of ayin tov, of being gracious, and also the importance of understanding what true emet is. Any questions, comments?
Her status in society and how it's represented. Not to the point, but to enlighten others to tell.
Correct. And what just an important point is that what's interesting to me is that how the Talmud frames that, right? The Talmud doesn't demonize her for that. The Talmud doesn't necessarily view her as an oddity. There's a little bit of a normalizing. She may have been unique. She may not have been unique. We don't really know. We only know who's recorded for posterity. But the fact that she's recorded and the fact that her opinions are quoted to this day and in a seemingly positive way. I mean, my understanding of these sources is that it's pretty positive about Yalta's interjection in all of these situations. Tells us something as well from 1900 years ago, right? 1800 years ago. Okay. We will. That's why that's right. Nobody could